Excuse me. So there's a few ideas that are kind of weaving themselves together here this morning, and we'll probably go from one to the other and back. But if you take nothing else away from today, I invite you to consider impermanence, ineffableness, ineffable. It's funny. Ineffable means you can't say it, and I couldn't. And then inevitableness. Impermanent, ineffable, inevitable. And what do we mean by those things? What are the importance of those things? We are here in this time, at this time, in this place, and we are experiencing life mostly in 3 dimensions, mostly through our 5 senses, through the rhythms of night and day, excuse me, through the rhythms of the season, through the cycle of birth and life and death. And part of us wants to accept that as our only reality. This is the way it is because this is the way it appears to be to us, and therefore it must be right. And yet part of us knows that that's not true. In fact, that can't be true. Because everything that we see, everything about us, this rock that we're riding around the sun on, the sun itself, the galaxy itself, the universe itself, everything that we see is impermanent. It is impermanent. Everything about us, our bodies included, everything about us is in the process of going away. It is in the process of dissolving. So that which is temporary, that which is impermanent, that which comes into expression and falls back out of expression, that in and of itself is not reality. Excuse me. As much as we would like to pretend that it is not. There is something else. There is something else from which all of this comes. So if we move beyond, so now we're going to the ineffable again. If we move beyond the various expressions, the various comings and goings, right? The universes are born and the universes are die. In the Hindu philosophy it says, the Brahman opens its eyes and the universe is created, closes its eyes and the universe is gone. Things come and things go, but from where? From where do they come? From where? And to where do they go? So the impermanence comes from the permanence. And that which is impermanent in itself is an expression of that which is permanent. And when it ceases to express in that particular way, that particular manner, that particular form, it once again rejoins with the permanence. In some of the Buddhist traditions, and Buddhist traditions have a great deal of spiritual practices that are designed for a specific progression of the adherence along the spiritual path, right? Spiritual path, the way I'm using it here today, a spiritual path is our journey from this illusion of separation, from this dream of separation, back to that experience, that ineffable experience of oneness, that ineffable experience of unity. And in some of the Buddhist traditions, the way that they train the adherents to embrace impermanence is to have them go and meditate at the burning grounds for days. Now, in that culture, the burning grounds was where the bodies were cremated, and depending upon how big the particular village might be, there might be fires all the time, or it might just be fires every once in a while. But the adherents would go and sit and they would meditate, and they would see the wood stacked up. They would see the corpse placed upon the pile of wood. They would see the fire as it was lit. And then they would watch everything that was once so very real, the hardness of the wood, the reality of the body of the deceased, and all of it would be rendered into ash. And the idea is that by sitting there for days in a meditation, making the observing of the cremations their meditation, they came to a deeper realization that life as we know it here is impermanent. It is impermanent. So then what we are left with when we come to realize that life itself, the life that we know, the world that we have created, we human beings that we have created here, the rules, the regulations, the societies, the businesses, the jobs, all of these different things that are constructions of the human mind, that all of these things too are impermanent. If you look at the businesses that existed hundreds of years ago, most of them are gone. A few have managed to continue in operation over hundreds of years, but most of them are gone. If you look at the people who operated those businesses, they're all gone. They're all gone. If you look at the products and the services that the businesses made, many of them are obsolete and no longer required. Entire industries, gone. Things that were so important to our society at one time, so important to our civilization, no longer needed. At one time, great sailing ships crossed the oceans, and there was a need for shipwrights and sailmakers. And then the steam engine came along. And the point there is that all of these things that human consciousness accepts as reality and places a great deal of importance in, and in some ways insists that we all fall into that dream and dedicate our lives to pursuing those things, all of that is impermanent. So at some point along our path, at some point as we are going through the process of maturing spiritually, we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. And I don't know when each person is going to do it. I think we all do it eventually, each according to his or her own timeline. But the first might be, well, what is reality? And the second might be, what is the most important thing in my life? What is the most important thing in my life? And I put the question of reality first, because unless we know what that is, the answer to the second question is going to be based on a delusion. I go to the to the gym and they've got the TVs turned on, and there are people who sit there for hours and hours and hours and talk about all different aspects of sports. And there's nothing wrong with sports, there's nothing wrong with talking about sports. But these folks can go on for hours and hours and hours. And the guys at work used to be involved in the fantasy football teams. And they would be buying and selling and trading imaginary players and building imaginary teams, and then every week looking at the scores and the statistics for each players to figure out how well their fantasy team did. And they were almost consumed with it, at least what I could see of them, during breaks and lunch, during the workday. They would come over and chat with one another, oh, do you think I should trade so-and-so? He didn't do so well last week. Yeah, I would cut him. He's not cutting it. You need to get rid of him and get somebody. And they were involved. They were involved with these things that in and of themselves there's nothing wrong with. But if we step back far enough and look at them as we progress on our spiritual path, we would have to say to ourselves, is that what I want to give my time to? Is that the most important thing for me to be doing right now? Now, if our concept of reality is that this three-dimensional world in which we live is reality, then that might make perfectly good sense. Perfectly good sense. Throw ourselves into a business, build up a business, make a lot of money, have great investments, leave wealth for the future generations, our heirs. And then when we die, well, then we've left something behind. We've accomplished something. That's the way of the world, the way the world looks at things. But if our concept of reality, if we slightly change our point of view, and if our concept of reality is not the details and the workings and the outpicturings of culture and society as human beings have created them, but if our view of reality is that which is beyond, that which from all of these things arise, then perhaps the most important thing in our life is to experience as much of that reality as we can, to move closer to it in our consciousness, to remove from our consciousness everything which distracts us, everything which takes us away, everything which is not real. Everything which is not real. So one analogy might help a little bit, and it's one that teachers use a lot, and it's the ocean and the wave. The ocean, for the sake of the example, can be considered to be permanent. The wave can be considered to be temporary, impermanent. Now the wave is part of the ocean. The wave is the ocean expressing itself as a wave. But the wave is not a separate identity than the ocean. It's not a separate being, you know. It's just the ocean being a wave. And we have each of these individual waves, and they're each unique, and they're each kind of expressing themselves in a unique way, you know. Some are tall, some are short, some are rolling over and making big white caps, you know, all these kind of things. I used to enjoy looking at when we lived down at the coast, looking at the weather reports, and there's a sea buoy out by the Frying Pan Shoals Tower, and on days when it was a little bit windy, frequently the report would say, "The seas are confused. The seas are confused," meaning that the waves are coming from every which way and breaking every which way, you know. And it's not just a steady roll from one direction that you might be able to point your bow into and ride over, but they were coming every which way. If you went out there in your boat that day, you were going to be getting hit from every side. We can be confused. Society can be confused. And the great confusion is that we think we are different than the ocean. We think we are separated from the ocean. We think we are individual, not individualized. And there's this illusion that we keep up. There's this illusion that we keep up by trying to pretend that we are separate from everyone, we are separate from everything, that we are the center of our own universe. And we kind of go through life keeping up that facade. And we try to bring people into our lives who will help us to keep up that facade. And all that is doing is keeping us from the inevitable. Right? So here's where the inevitable comes in. The inevitable is that we must return to the experience of the oneness. That is why we were created. Now we have come here to have an individualized experience. We have come here to develop our uniqueness. And in so doing, it was necessary in part that we forgot. We forgot most of our oneness. But we never forgot it all. We never could forget it all, because it is what is calling us back home. Again, Rumi gives us a beautiful example of the reed flute. You know, he says we are like the reed that has been cut from the riverbed and turned into a flute. And the sound that comes through us is our longing and our crying to be reunited, because we know that we belong in that riverbed. We know that we belong back where we came. So there is that within us that no matter what we try to do, the poet says that we can desecrate but never destroy the life that is within us. And that life is the life that has come from the permanence into the experience of the impermanence, and then returns to the experience of the permanence. There is that within us that knows that we need to go home, knows that we ought to go home, knows that that is the destination, that is where we are heading. And I think once we come to an understanding, an acceptance perhaps is a better word, of the fact that it is inevitable that we do so, then the most important thing in our life becomes preparing ourselves for that. Opening our hearts up to a deeper experience of the love and the presence of the divine. Eliminating from our lives everything and anything and everyone and anyone who distracts us from this purpose. So Rumi then gives us the example of the moth returning to the flame. The persistence, the passion, the dedication of the moth, beating its head against the glass or over the candle, flying into it over and over and over again. The one thing that it seems that that moth wants more than anything is to be united with the candle. And then one night, the glass is set aside for some reason, the candle is lit, and the moth has its opportunity, and it flies straight into the flame. And he goes on to tell us that even though the flame consumes the body of the moth, it is willing to release and let go of everything and anything it has in order to experience the ecstasy, the bliss of the unification. Now Rumi was a mystic. And Rumi had these experiences of the ineffable that we call the mystical experiences. The little glimpses that we get as we go through life where we slip out of this reality as we know it and we experience the deeper reality. We experience, to the degree that we can, we experience the presence of the divine. Now our Wednesday night group is reading a book called The Leap by Steve Taylor, which is about, he calls it awakenings. And he kind of covers a lot of different things that he categorizes as awakenings, but part of them are what Richard Maurice Buck in his book Cosmic Consciousness would call the experiences of the cosmic mind. We would call them the mystical experiences. And while the one characteristic of these is that they are ineffable, right? There's no words to describe them. And in classes we use the example of chocolate. You taste chocolate and try to explain to someone who never had chocolate what chocolate is. And there's no way to effectively communicate that. You can say, well, it's like this and it's like that, or it's sweet or it's creamy. But that's not chocolate, see? Those are just some characteristics of chocolate. So some characteristics then of of this experience of that which from which the impermanence comes and from which the impermanence returns. Part of the characteristics of that are this sense of unity, this sense of oneness, this sense of the separation is gone, and there is not me and everyone else. There is not even us, you see. But there is the one life expressing itself as us, and we are all connected, and there is no separation. There is only uniqueness. And I think if you consider the words of Dr. Holmes when he says, I am not my brother's keeper, I am my brother. This is that feeling that there's no difference between you and I. There's a uniqueness, there's an individuality, but the essence of who and what we are is the same. And there is no me and there is no you, but there is the love of the divine expressing as both of us at the same time. Some of the Hindu mystics try to put it this way, and again, we're trying to describe the indescribable. So some of the Hindu mystics put it this way, is that the divine is completely aware of its unity. It is completely aware of its oneness. It is completely aware of every aspect of its own being. And that awareness, that unity, falls into multiplicity here on earth as us. But whereas we awaken in this dream and we think that we are separated from and apart and different than everything else, the divine never loses the consciousness that all of this is itself. All of this is itself. It is one and many both at the same time. This is important for us to remember as we go through life. What this means then is that the divine knows you and I as an expression of itself. And it can only want for you and I what it would want for itself. All of the divine is for us. None of the divine is against us. But as I said last week, we have to accept the invitation. We have to get ourselves to the party. So we understand now that our traditional view of what is real is not true. It's like Plato tells us in his analogy of the cave in his work, The Republic. You know, it's as if people have been raised in a cave in such a manner that they were chained and they couldn't see the opening of the cave, but could only see the shadows on the wall opposite the opening. And they grew up looking at those shadows, and they thought that those shadows were real. And of course, they were just people passing up and down the road. And one day, one of the people managed to break loose of the chains and went outside, and the first thing that happened, of course, is they were blinded by the light. Again, another characteristic of the mystical experience. They were blinded by the light, but when they started to see, they could see that there was a whole nother world, there was a whole nother reality, there was a whole different way of perceiving. And they realized that the experience that they had while growing up in the cave, even though it appeared to be completely real to them, it was limited. So they go back into the cave and they tell everybody, boy, oh boy, have I got news for you. I've broken free of my chains. I went outside, there's a whole different world out there, and everything that we thought, everything that we looked at, everything that we believed to be real is only a shadow. It is only a projection of something else. The real world is out there. This is a dream. This is an illusion. And what Plato goes on to tell us is that the other people thought, there's something wrong with that guy. Losing his mind. Must be sick. Must be crazy. We need to take care of him. The mind that is so locked into the belief of what we are experiencing now as being the only reality is not yet ready to see the truth. Not yet ready to see the truth. But we understand that everything is impermanent. Everything that we see is impermanent. It is not the ultimate reality. There is that which gives rise to the impermanence, and there is that which the impermanence returns to, much as the wave gets its rise from the ocean and goes back down into the ocean. So beyond this illusion of reality is this ineffable something, this ineffable unity, this ineffable oneness this ineffable consciousness that is called by many names. We call it God, we call it love, we call it the divine, we call it nature, we call it spirit. But it simply is. It simply is. It is the I am of Moses. It is the isness or the suchness of the Buddha. And it is the ineffableness from which we come and from which we know we are part of. And part of us knows that our purpose is to return in experience to it, to awaken from the dream of separation. Joel Goldsmith, and I know I've used this before, but it's very powerful. Joel Goldsmith says, if you look in the book of Genesis, we are told that God put Adam into a deep sleep. But nowhere does it tell us that Adam woke up. And of course, Adam is all of us. And we are all in that deep sleep until we choose to awaken. Until we say, now is my time. Now is my time to step forward. We are all in that Adam dream, dreaming that the world as we experience it is the ultimate reality. And the point of awakening is an individualized point. Each of us must respond to the call when it comes to us. We understand the impermanence. We understand the reality is something that the intellect can't grasp. Therefore, it is ineffable. But the soul can experience, the spirit can experience the essence of what we are, knows, you see. And it is this experience of the unity of life. That is what we crave. That is what we truly desire. That is what we are seeking, even though we may be seeking it in all of the different distractions of the world. Ultimately, that is what we are seeking. And then we come to realize that it is inevitable. It is inevitable that we will one day awaken, whether it be today or tomorrow or whether it was yesterday. One day we will awaken and we will be like that moth and we will be focused on getting to the flame. Now, in the book of Genesis, we are told that Adam and Eve left the garden and there were two cherubim stationed there to prevent them from getting back. Right? And again, remember, this is mythology and it's very important. And what was back in the garden is the tree of life. See, the experience that we are having is the experience of the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil. Not the reality of good and the reality of evil, but the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil. But the tree of life awaits our return. And in Buddhism you have a similar imagery where you have the Buddha inside a cave in deep meditation. And outside the cave there are two ugly guards. Scary looking guards, ugly guards outside the cave. And the Buddha has his hand up in a stop motion, kind of like a crossing guard holding their hand up to stop traffic. Stop. And what Joseph Campbell tells us is that stop is telling us don't pay any attention to these distractions because they are not real. They are delusions of your own mind. Come in, come to the peace. And what those two guards represent in the two different mythologies are our fears and our attachments. Those are the two things that are keeping us from going back to the experience of unity. So what are we afraid of? What are we afraid of? You know, the New Testament tells us that perfect love casts out fear. And if you don't know love, you don't know God. So whatever we are afraid of is something where we have not realized the goodness of God yet. And therefore our fears represent an opportunity for us to grow. Susan Jeffers wrote a powerful book called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. In Buddhism, we're told if somebody makes you angry, thank them because they have shown you an area where you are ready to grow. Because why would you be angry? Because anger comes from fear. So one thing we can do is we can ask ourselves, what am I afraid of? Now, of course, you're going to have to do this within your own mind. Many people don't like to admit what they're afraid of. But nevertheless, if there's a fear there, then the opportunity is to ask yourselves, what if I knew that all of the divine was with me? What if I knew that perfect love was with me? What if I really believed that 1,000 would fall at thy right and 10,000 at thy left, and all of the other protection prayers in scriptures? And perhaps the most important question of all is, would God be afraid of this? Would the perfection of the divine be afraid of this? And then the other side of the cave, the other side of the door to the cave, is attachments. You see, the moth was willing to fly into the flame and release its attachment to its physical body, to let go of everything for the experience of the bliss. And we have, in our life, we have become attached to many things. We have become attached to material things, which we now know are dissolving, right? They're impermanent. We have become attached emotionally to people or pets or things. Most importantly, I think we've become attached to our identity, to our ego. We think we are the collection of ideas the intellect has assembled and says, that is you. This is who I am. This is the way it ought to be. And we cling to that and we hold on to that and we try to mold the world and get the world to appear to us the way that we want it to be. And this is why the idea of the dissolution of the ego, the release of the ego, the letting go of the ego, is an important concept in our spiritual growth. The I that I think I am is not real, does not exist other than in my head. It is only an opinion. And opinions may be right and opinions may be wrong. But opinions come and opinions go, and opinions too are impermanent. As we start to lose this idea of separation, as we start to awaken from the dream of separation, the idea of an I separate from the divine, separate from everyone else, begins to fade for us. It doesn't mean that we don't continue to do things. It doesn't mean that we don't continue to have friends and relationships and loves. Excuse me. But the sense of I am doing it, or it is about me, is gone. The divine is loving another by means of me. The divine is loving me by means of another. The divine is loving itself. through us and as us. In the New Testament we have Jesus saying, I of my own self can do nothing, but it is the Father within me that does the works. That is the experience of the Christ. This life that animates the spirit in this body, I did not create. I can do nothing of myself, but the Spirit within me, the Father within me, the love of the divine within me does it all. And at that point, I think when we start to get there comes the great surrender. The great surrender. The great, not my will, but thine be done. We start to recognize that whatever we are, it's not what we thought we were, but it is as an instrument, like the reed flute. It is as an expression of, it is as an ambassador of divine love. Divine love. Our own wants, our own desires, the objects of our will and volition become less and less important to us. Our desire is the unification, and one way we can experience that more fully is in service. How might divine love give of itself through me today? Rumi says love is like perfume. You cannot put some on another without getting a little on yourself. How might divine love express through me and as me today, and as it does so, as it fulfills itself through me and as me, I experience the unity. I experience the oneness. There's a story of an old teacher in the East who was renowned for helping the students to reach enlightenment. And the students would come to him. And of course he would say, why are you here? And they would say, well, we've heard you are a great guru and you can help us to reach enlightenment. And he would say to them, what is the one thing that you are most afraid I'm going to tell you you have to do? And they each knew. For each it was different, but they each knew. And he said, go do it. Go do it. That was the one thing that they were holding on to. That was their attachment. That was what they were not willing to let go of. And that is what was holding them back. So I invite you as you go through the rest of this day, please take some time today to just go sit and be still. And ask yourself, what is reality? What is the most important thing in my life right now? And what is the one thing I most do not want to let go of? Find a way to let it go. It's leaving anyway. It's impermanent anyway. It is dissolving anyway. It is only an illusion. So this week, let's awaken from the dream. Or at least, let's renew our commitment to awaken from the dream. Let's get outside the cave. Let's go back to that reed bed that is calling us home. Let's embrace the inevitability of our spiritual journey. Let's surrender to it. And so it is.